Hello, humans. Hello, humans. Sunday, June 7th, 8:24 a.m. Slurps, coffee. Anyway, so I have some things I need to get done. This is going to be a reasonably quick little discussion about an interesting subject that you should be aware of, and most people are not, and that is deflation. So, in order to understand deflation, you need to understand the nature of our reality at a financial level. And so we have money, and you don't use money. You use currency or a derivative. So all of your electronic payments are a derivative of a currency. They're a part of a payment system. You say you send money. You go to your online thing and you say, I'm going to send money to, Bob the plumber, right, for fixing my leak. But you're not. What you're actually doing is causing digits to be transferred and put into a repository that's under Bob's name. So you're not actually using even currency. You're using a derivative. If you were to take the Federal Reserve note, your $1 bill, and you were to go to a convenience store, then you're using the currency itself. You're taking and making a transaction where you're going to get an item of value for that piece of paper, which has no intrinsic value at all. Money has intrinsic value. So, and money can't usually be destroyed. So if you were to go in and it was allowed and you wanted to, if you ever watch the John Wick movies, right? He buys dinner reservations, which is body removal, gold coin per corpse. And so he's using actual money in that transaction. He's buying a service, the removal of the body and the cleaning up, at the rate of a single ounce of gold that will be able to be transferred to somebody else, to somebody else, to somebody else. And it can't really be destroyed. You can smash it and all of that, but it'll still be an ounce of gold. There is some marginal utility, some marginal value added by having it stamped as a Krugerrand or a Walking Liberty U.S. Coin, that kind of thing. And basically, it's simply an ounce of gold is the money itself. Same thing is true of silver, but these days we destroy silver in a sense by getting it out of the financial system and locking it up in some electronic device which we're too lazy or too inefficient to recover the silver from. And so we throw the whole computer into the trash and it goes into the dump. And we could have recovered all kinds of little bits of silver in there if we'd thought about it and actually wanted to do it. But there's an energy cost and so on. And silver didn't used to be that valuable. And so we wouldn't do that. So we would lose silver. It would be destroyed in a financial sense because it was not recoverable to be used in future transactions. Okay, so that's money. Something solid that has intrinsic value that usually can't be destroyed, that people want and will exchange goods and services for. Everything else is layered upon that. And so we have a layer that we call the US dollar, which is created as a currency. The value of currencies exists to the government, not to the people per se, although there are secondary values to the people themselves. The value to government for currency over sound money is the actual cost of the currency versus the cost of the money. So there is a cost in gold. So you got to go up to Alaska, you got to freeze your ass off, you got to take tons of food, all kinds of equipment, and dig this stuff out, and then you got to smelt it to purify it and smack it all around, and then you got to move it, and it's real heavy, so it costs a lot of energy to ship the stuff. Basically, the same thing true of silver as money, and it doesn't matter where you mine it, there are always intrinsic costs that are baked into the cake with the sound money itself. It costs you effort, physical labor. You add value with that energy to the creation of that money. And this is very tedious for government. Government doesn't want to fuck with this, although they used to. So government was the ones that promoted the California gold rush. They provided special trains. They did everything they could to get young, stupid men out there to destroy the landscape and hunting for gold. They did the same thing with Alaska. They've done this with every gold rush up to the point of the Federal Reserve being created, which we'll get into in a bit here. And the reason that they do this is that government is constrained in their spending by the amount of money in circulation. Okay, so that's a key thing you need to remember. This stuff is not particularly complex, but it's complicated because all these parts fit together, and you have to bear in mind one part and how it affects another. So if you don't have, if there's only 30 gold coins in your whole fucking state, that's the limit of the liquidity in your whole fucking state. And so 30 people can only be exchanging those coins at any given time. So there is not much activity. There's not much economic activity going on in that particular state. At that point, right? And so periodically throughout the United States the history of the United States, we've had the government go out, find that there's been a gold strike somewhere, and capitalize on that by pumping it up, by getting the social order all whipped up, and providing facilities that would allow more people to get out there. And so this can be as simple as, making sure the shovel manufacturers have enough iron or whatever, right? That kind of thing. But they did do that because they want those gold coins to be circulating, because that gives government itself more freedom, more liquidity, and more ability to get things done. So there's ratios, all this math and stuff involved, right? Anyway, so you can see that if you got to go out and dig the gold, mine it, and all of this kind of stuff, set up foundries to purify it and all of this kind of stuff, the sound money is expensive to deal with as money. And so currency, which is a thing called fiat, okay, which means it's created, and has no intrinsic value of itself, comes into existence. So in those societies, there's been economists and and anthropologists that'll go and study it, and you find out that in places like the island of Yap, they used giant fucking stones as money. Stones too big to move, but you nominally had ownership of it, so that was your money. And it didn't function very well because the trading of these stones was a bitch, as you can imagine. Anyway, though, so we've used all different kinds of things for currency as well as all different kinds of things for money. Ultimately, money comes down to the energy to survive, right? Calories, food, shelter, these kind of things. That's really the base of all money is survival. Everything else on top of that, layered on up to your Gucci bags, is simply fluff, right? And it exists because of currency. If you got to go mine gold for yourself, you're not going to give that gold to your woman to go out and buy a fucking Gucci bag, right? Your back will hurt too much from crawling in that hole and digging the gold out. Now, if you got to go work 8 hours and they're constantly producing more and more of these currencies and you get more of them, well, it's less of an issue to give the currency to the woman to go get the Gucci bag, which you personally don't have much, you don't put much value in it, right? As a male, I mean. Anyway, so just to give you this frame of reference here, right? We're structuring all of this so that you'll understand where we're at and what's happening. Okay, so governments like growth. They want to be able to pat themselves on the chest and say, we created all this great growth. We did this. None of that is factual. They're just taking credit for stuff that's happening throughout the social order. But letting that aside, they can't create growth without liquidity. Part of that liquidity is a thing called flow, okay, or the rapidity which the money moves through the system. The flow of the currency, and we call it currency, currents in a river, right? Current to the time. Those sorts of things are not accidental. So what we do with currency is we create a derivative off of money. And the derivative is easier to create and takes less costs than the actual money itself, and that's why it's valuable. So we get value because we don't put energy into the creation of solid money. We as a species get value because it costs us a lot less energy to go on out and fall down some trees and make, it's linen paper, but, to harvest flax and these kind of things and make a linen, and then to stamp a bunch of words on it, and then we transfer that between us. That's the actual currency. That's the fiat dollar. It's a created thing. We can make as many as we want. The issue comes in that we have to balance all of this, that at some point you can't have an unbacked currency, right? Even now, we don't have an unbacked currency. We're close. We're teetering on the edge of it. But our currency, our latest, there were three currencies in existence in the United States. They own everything because they can create currency that you'll accept as money in lieu of money out of thin air, or basically a few linen rags. And so it's easy. The corruption comes with it because these are unprincipled people, and they know they can take advantage of the situation. And so here's the thing about currencies, though. Okay, so we've had these two other currencies in our United States history. Both of them are now defunct. One around the Revolutionary War, and the other at the end of the Civil War. Note the war aspect. You always get wars when you have fiat currencies dying. And fiat currencies need wars for all different kinds of reasons. Governments need wars under a fiat currency. They don't need wars under a sound currency, under a sound money. They do under currency because in order for, currency has a number of different failures. The chief failure of it is that it is a loan. It's a debt. And so they take an interest off of the economy. So the banksters suck energy and power and control and effort and profit out of the economy for every dollar that they produce. And it doesn't cost them anything much to produce a dollar. So they get a lot of value for very little effort. And so they become centers of corruption. This can't be helped. It's known as an aspect of this. It's a self-limiting issue, okay? Because in all currencies, what happens always is that they have a certain amount of a lifespan, the corruption gets too bad, and then they crash, and then they die, and they're replaced at some point by another currency. Or we use sound money for a long time, and government bitches, and then they figure out some way to get another currency involved. There are evils with currency that need not exist, okay? And I can explain that if I've got the time here. But anyway, so getting back to the deflationary aspect of things. Every currency faces a terrible situation as an abstract, right? The currency itself is an instrument of debt. So when they were first issued, you got a dollar you could use from the Federal Reserve, and you could use it as though it were a dollar in gold. And it was even convertible to gold. So you could take 20 of these dollars and go into any Federal Reserve chartered bank, present those $20 and get an ounce of gold. That was the deal that was made with the Federal Reserve. Not that it was backed by gold, but that it was convertible at a fixed price. And it turns out that they didn't understand economic theory very well, and what they ended up doing was screwing the dollar and the fiat currency and the government all in that single instance, that there was a fixed price for an ounce of gold, because gold was still circulating as money during that period of time that we had the initial Federal Reserve in 1913. And it circulated for a number of years. So you always had a legitimate tell, a real valuable tell as to the value of the currency. And it was a hedge, or it was a block against inflation. The problem is you need to inflate currencies constantly just in order to keep liquidity moving, because they allow, the whole point of currencies is to allow financing, a financial system, and in financing you give loans. But the hidden aspect of this for the system is that whenever a loan is paid off, it withdraws liquidity from the system. The system shrinks. So right now, if everybody in the United States were to rush on out, they manifested through, praying to their big toe, they manifested millions of actual dollars, and they went in and they paid off their mortgages, our entire global economy would crash. It would just die. And the dollar would die, every other currency would die, the German mark would die, the euro would die, all of these things would just cease to exist, because the debt would be paid off to such a huge level that there would be no circulating currency at all. Now, this is sort of, in a way, what happened in the 1930s. So what happened was, in a general sense, a very crude description, the World War I caused specific social changes, skilled and educated labor, because a lot of these guys died off. That made their energy into the system that much more valuable, so they had to be paid more. That put an inflationary pressure on all aspects of manufacturing and doing any damn thing, to the point where they really started in the 1920s trying to do a social engineering for a couple of different reasons, but one was to get women in the workplace to try and drive down the cost of labor. Okay, so all these things have to be balanced from a government's viewpoint. None of this has to be balanced if you use sound money, but you always have to with currency. And whatever you have to do, you've got to keep, as a government or a bankster, you've got to keep the currency inflating constantly in order to maintain the illusion of value within the currency. Because if you don't, here's what happens. In 1929, they had the Roaring Twenties, all kinds of excess everywhere here in Europe, throughout Asia, vast quantities of currency being printed and spent, and it caused all kinds of economic activity, but there was no inherent follow through. So there was a lot of bad economic activity in the 1920s that was propped up by the effusive feelings of men returning from World War I, the release of the tension of the wars. Even though there was war going on in China and Manchuria and all of this kind of stuff, there was still not this presence in the banking centers, this depressive kind of all the spending having to go to war. It was all of a sudden freed up, and it went back into the social order. And all that spending of currency excited a lot of economic activity. People did shit. They went out and they created new businesses. We got Ford, we got Tesla, we got all these people in the 1920s, right? At their rising up to their peak at that level. And that was a partial Edison. All of these guys owe all of their activity to the ending of the war and the shifting of the focus of the spending of the currency that had been thus created. And so another aspect of a currency itself is that once it's created, it keeps spending, it keeps multiplying throughout the system, keeps the system slightly inflated as it goes along. And but it's got to go somewhere, right? You got to put it to use, because it's not like gold. Gold just sits there. It doesn't get any less valuable. It doesn't get any more valuable. It may change its price in a currency, but that's the currency being deflated or inflated, not the gold itself. Currency, on the other hand, like all these cartels down in Latin America with these warehouses full of dollars, they're really fools, because we could decide tomorrow that no Federal Reserve note made before this time and coming in from the outside the United States has any value at all. And they would instantly crash. It would be like the Weimar Republic. We could strip them of wealth just by making a couple of policy decisions. Anyway, though, so you're vulnerable with currencies, and you have to keep them in motion, the liquidity, the circulation, in order that they have that value. In the 1920s, the US dollar was inflated through that entire economic period. Banks got the ability to make loans and then tie them back into the Federal Reserve, so you had these other entities that were also making loans other than the Federal Reserve, and it started really growing. And we started getting into this, running into basically the beginnings of the same kind of situation that had just recently struck Germany with the Weimar Republic in 1922 and 1923, where their currency output increased fivefold, but their economic activity fell. And so that was a giant situation. That was where you would get a wheelbarrow full of money just for your monthly salary, but you still couldn't pay for your rent. That sort of a deal, right? Or currency, get a wheelbarrow full of currency. And that's no joke. They literally had wheelbarrows full of Reichsmarks, or German marks. Bundes something, I can't remember. Anyway, so in the 1920s here in the United States, we inflate the amount of activity relative to the currencies, and it reaches a peak. And we have this, everybody suddenly starts feeling wealthy. They start getting money. The newspaper boy at the hotel gets a $20 tip, which if he was smart, he could have, lived on that for 3 years at that point. But he puts it into the stocks, right? And so everything got inflated, and then we had the giant crash that was engineered by the big boys, the Rockefellers, all of these kind of people. And they crashed the stock market at that stage for their own reasons and their own purposes. Nonetheless, it was coincident with, and it was a natural side effect of the inflation of currencies leading to a deflationary episode, which we saw. 29 didn't cause the Depression. A lot of people pegged that the Depression, the Great Depression, they call it, to 1929, and that's false. Really, the Depression itself, no one was using those terms, very few people, until 32 and 33. That's when the bonds crashed. And so here's the lay of the land on that. The dollar was convertible to gold at the rate of $20 to a single ounce of gold. And that was a problem because it was a fixed amount. And so they couldn't inflate the currency. They couldn't make the currency, couldn't make more currency to get more, to stimulate more liquidity because it was at this fixed rate. So they needed to get rid of this peg to gold. It wasn't actually backed, but it was convertible. And so they needed to induce inflation into the system in order for the system to keep running, because we'd hit this point in the early 30s where lots of people were paying off debt, which caused, as a result of making good choices with stock market and all of this kind of stuff. It had an ancillary effect of making all their neighbors think and themselves think that they were geniuses. And then they overextended, got more loans, etc., which piled in on all of it. But prior to that, between 1928 and 1931, or almost 31, there was this weird thing, this little dip in the production of debt relative to the increase in the amount of currency. And it was all these people that had hit and were paying off their loans and stuff. Anyway, so and there was also an expansion. There was also what was known as the Banana Wars or Banana Republic Wars, right? Where the United States military was sent down into Central America on behalf of the fruit companies to enforce basically their edicts that we own this place and you got to farm these bananas or guavas or whatever the fuck for us. Anyway, and so that caused an interesting effect in terms of getting money in circulation in a particular way that ended up being a void, and it was a drawdown on the system as a whole. There's a lot of people that seem to peg those wars to the subsequent deflation that hit us in the 30s. The deflation started in 1929 in the sense of the stock market crash, but it reinflated, went back to up to its old levels relatively quickly. It didn't recover because there wasn't strength there, because there was still a lot more selling than there was buying, even though the prices were heading back up to their old levels. Anyway, so the dollar at that point, they had come on another scheme and they had done initial loans and backed by the very first of the derivatives that you can pile onto currency, which is a bond. A bond is an arrangement, a contract that specifies you'll get paid X amount of value in the form, in this case, in the form of certain currency in X amount of years for buying or giving us a loan now. And so it's a fixed rate of interest or a variable rate of interest, doesn't matter, but a fixed term. And so they started issuing bonds of all kinds, and the bonds crashed in the 1930s. Corporate bonds were the trigger there, not so much government bonds, because there were restrictions on how much debt government could take on, unlike today. And this was part of the solution of the deflation crisis that arose in the 1930s, was to convince the populace that or tell the populace that we're going to vote on these laws that allow government to get massively in debt. And that was quite deliberate in order to pump the economy up, because the economy was so close to completely collapsing and causing the dissolution of the United States as a federal republic, right? Due to the inept management of the feds, the local government everywhere. It was just a bad system running on bad currency, badly managed, and it got really caught up in the inevitable deflationary crisis. The bond crash in 1932 and 33, it was a wavy thing, set off the depression in earnest all the way through 1939, and what it took to get out of that depression was a global war. Again, another hoaxed up thing, right? But in order to get the financial system started again. Anyway, so in 1932, 33, there was a big deflationary hit. Money and liquidity dried up everywhere. It was so bad here in Washington State that in one of the small hamlets here in Thurston County, in Tenino, they actually made and manufactured wooden nickels, because a nickel was a valuable amount of money at the time, valuable amount of currency. They didn't have any currency circulating in the county. So they created their own, and it was wooden nickels manufactured within the county and accepted at the stores and so on. They thought it was a stopgap. It wasn't long-lived or anything, and it did function. It did do the work. And they didn't have to manufacture with metal or gold or anything. but it was that bad. Liquidity was that bad. So the government decided to do something. They decided that they needed to inflate the currency. That is, which is a way of saying we need to deflate the apparent value in our currency. All right, because we're facing deflation, which is in our liquidity. So they were facing a situation where the liquidity had slowed down to nothing, just a bare dribble. And their solution at that time, which worked, was to create more dollars so that they could get it out there at basically a cheaper rate against the same amount of gold in the system. So they're always trying to balance against the real value in the system, against the gold at that point, because that's where we stored value at that point, was within gold and silver coins. And so that was our nominal backing or convertibility. And so what they did was it was a three-pronged attack. Government declared that U.S. citizens could no longer own gold, that the Treasury was out of the business of producing gold coins as solid money for the United States, and that thereafter the Treasury would only produce, the U.S. Mint would only produce gold coins for value storage, for collectability. In other words, they were giving up on the idea of solid money operating in a parallel and active system with the currency at the same time, because there's always been circulating gold coins as money. They can't tax it. There's real problems with all of this. They don't know the circulation of it. They do know all of that with the currency. They don't know it with such things as gold coins. And so this is a problem for government and led to many of their other problems. Anyway, and so what they did was to say U.S. citizens can't own gold, and although gold is still legal tender, we don't want you using it, and so you'd better just use the dollar. And that's when they made the U.S. dollar backed by the full faith and credit of the U.S. government and legal as tender for all debts, public and private. In other words, you could pay taxes at the state level with it, as well as use it in your poker game, right? And so they changed the dollar at that stage in the 30s from its use as a circulating alternative, lightweight alternative to real money. And when they did that, they revalued the system itself. So they seized all the gold. The reason they were able to seize, well, they paid for it nominally at $20 an ounce. But the reason they were able to seize gold was because prior to that time, you could get a loan on your gold coins in currency. So I could take in 10 gold coins, each worth $20, and I could get a loan of 200 cash dollars for those 10 gold coins. And I'd still have the gold after I paid that loan back, right? As opposed to actually spending out the gold and then not being able to recover it. So currency was useful to individuals at that level. Anyway, so what they did was to say, you guys can't circulate this stuff anymore, but you can buy it, and it'll still be worth what it's worth. But then what they did was they said, by official edict, basically, gold is now worth $33 an ounce. Later, they changed it to $35. But so they took gold from $20 an ounce up to $33 an ounce overnight. Boink. And this was at the same time that the FBI raided all these bank safe deposit boxes. The reason they were able to do that was because you could use gold as a loan, but the bank had to hold it. And you, even though it was held in your safety deposit box, and gold could be insured. So you could have your gold insured and put it into a bank. Then if the bank got robbed, they would give you enough currency to rebuy the gold, was the thinking. And here the government came and robbed the gold. True, they paid you off at $20, but it was instantly worth $13 more an ounce. So you kind of got shafted, right? Over that, I think it was a course of 6 weeks all this took place. Really, it was only this one long three-day weekend that most of the thievery was done by the FBI and those guys, Treasury agents. And so if you didn't have your gold insured and it wasn't involved in a loan, they didn't take it. They didn't know you had it. And so they couldn't get it. And so that was really the functioning of it then. So the point of this is that caused the inflation in the currency. Suddenly the amount of activity they could get out of the dollar from a government viewpoint rose by almost 50%. And it was enough to kickstart things, right? it was slow, and it kept, because we didn't have instant communications and all of these kind of things en masse, it took a long time for all this information and all these activities to filter through the social order. But it was their response to a necessary thing, which is the deflation. Deflation will always come to currencies that are debt, because that at some point paying off that debt becomes a huge impact to the system. And basically you can look at it this way. You can go validate anything I'm telling you with AI, but if you were to take out a loan from the system's viewpoint. Now, so bear in mind, at a systemic level, the system knows much more than an individual element of the system. So the system itself knows much more about the flow of dollars than the individual dollar itself that is in that flow, if you think about it this way. So anyway, when you take out a loan for $20 in 1914 or 15, and you pay it off, you've paid back $20 plus the little tiny bit of interest. Maybe it was 0.2% or something. It wasn't that much in a functional fashion. These days, when you pay off a loan, there's very little purchasing power within that dollar that you took out. So you're taking out more of them to get accomplished whatever it was you want. And there's also much more interest stacked on top of interest, on top of interest, on top of interest, because the dollars you use to give the federal government, you're borrowing. So you owe a debt just to pay your taxes. So if your taxes were $1,000, you basically are borrowing $1,000 of currency in order to pay the government. And at some point, that bank or whoever, Federal Reserve, creates that currency needs to get that $1,000 back plus the interest. And then within our system at this stage, how we work it here, that interest is never paid off, and it's cumulative. So the demand for the dollars creates the demand for the interest, and the whole system keeps inflating up to these limits. And in 1932, 33, they reached them, and they had to do something. They had to do that reset. We had another big reset that came in the mid-50s. They chose another route for that, which was the expansion of, I won't get into too much detail on any of these others. They chose the expansion of the United States into a global power at that stage in order to have the ability to export the deflationary tendencies within our currency. And they did that again in the 70s when they took us off the gold standard, right? There was no longer convertible. And that had lasted since like 56. And so each and every one of these fixes for their currency needs to happen in a shorter and shorter period of time, because they're all dealing with essentially the same flaw within the currency itself. And they all relate to deflation within the system at a systemic level. And that's where we're at now. So in my opinion, so we've gone through these in the 70s, through the petrodollar and so on. Then we had the big crash in 2008, also the tech boom and the tech crash in 2000 was an outgrowth of the solutions that were picked up in the 80s. And so they keep expanding the system, and it keeps crashing because of the same level of, or because of the same flaws within the currency system itself. And we're living through another one of those now. And so in my opinion, we are reflecting the 1920s, we're also reflecting 1932, and we're also reflecting 1954, and we're also reflecting 1971 in our current situation with deflation. And the government and so on has yet to actually make a move, nor the banks. They're trying things, they're trying these old fixes, and none of this is working. That's why Powell had to go, because his thinking on all this is so limited, and he's also a thieving crook, but that's a different issue. But they're not going to solve the problem. Trump and the government has a real big problem with deflation now. You're living in deflation. We've had fewer and fewer people participating in the labor market because of this deflation. It's obviously not a boom time, even though AI is growing and causing significant changes in the social order. The whole economic umbrella of activity is declining. All of this is a deflationary sign. We're in a deflationary spiral that will kill the currency. This is why people will say that the currencies die. Well, the Federal Reserve dollar officially died in 1932-33 and was replaced with another Federal Reserve dollar where the government held the gold as opposed to it being convertible to the people. And then in 1954, they said that outsiders, foreigners, could hold the gold. And they closed that window, and Nixon closed that window in the early 70s. And then they changed it so that the people could own the gold again, right? In the 70s, you could buy and hold the gold again. and trying to do anything to correct this flaw within currencies, which is the inherent multiplicity of debt attached to it that inevitably leads to deflationary spirals. We're in a deflationary spiral. In my opinion, we're in a depression. This depression is global. It's going to affect everything for a number of years, and it'll take us some time to get out of it. However, the whole point of all of this to this point is to tell you that right now there are aspects of our government, and let's call them the fiduciary authorities, those people within the banking system and so on, Treasury Department, this kind of thing, that do understand where we're at and how we have to, and the solution that's available to us. It's actually quite easy, this solution. You'll see it implemented over these next few years, and I'm going to discuss that. Now, I'm not telling anybody any financial advice. My point is not to try and advise you how to manage your money or your resources or your assets, okay? I don't give a shit about that. Bear in mind, I'm never going to contact you. I'm never going to try and involve you in any kind of a financial scheme. Anybody that is doing that is spoofing on me and my name, and they're a bunch of bastards, right? And they're trying to do you harm with their goofy ideas. I'm not trying to do you harm with my goofy ideas. I'm just telling you my goofy ideas such that you can put them into a framework and you can choose to accept them or not. My framework works for me, and I'm motivated to tell you this framework in case it might work for you, right? And so my framework says that we're in a deflationary spiral. We entered that in a few years back, and we're in the visibility aspect of it in 26 and 27. My framework says that by the end of 27, you'll see moves within government to correct this. You'll see the actual effects of these moves that will be made this year. And by the end of 27, you'll see a difference in the economic activity relative to what's being done this year. It's going to be chaotic. There's all kinds of things that are going to be happening as a result that are uncontrollable, that we don't manage, that are quite complex, and that will be interacting with each other. So this is not going to be a smooth road. However, we have a central, easy way out. And so in my opinion, what the governments and the fiduciary authorities will do will be to seize on Bitcoin. And they're actually going to seize Bitcoin from all these criminals, right? So all of the Somalis that put their illegal wealth into Bitcoin will see that the Bitcoin itself will be seized, and they won't have their wealth anymore, right? Their presumed wealth, their hoard of pirate loot, that kind of thing. And so that'll affect, so they'll seize Bitcoin from NGOs, they'll seize Bitcoin from Democrats that have been stashing, and all kinds of cryptos. I'm just saying BTC, right? Now, there, just as an aside, okay, so the out is the cryptos because they have zero marginal level of creation cost. Yes, there's the miners, but the miners are paid for the energy and the effort they're put in. The energy costs are self-balancing relative to the value of the Bitcoin, and so it's a zero impact on the government relative to this, and they can use these activities around cryptos as the new vehicle. Now, in doing so, they're basically going to inflate, just like in 1932, 33, 54, 56, 70 to 76, they are going to inflate the underlying notional understanding of the US dollar as currency, even though we're using digits. They're going to inflate that, and in order to cause an effect, which will be the speeding up of the flow of the currency as well as the multiplying of the outlets that currency can go to, which is basically what they think of as growth. And so the governments will be happy with this, right? And so this is an aspect of sci-fi world. We're not going to be pegged, not going to be held back by being tied to material things like actual sound money, like 10-ounce bar of gold or silver, right? We're not going to be pegged to the paper even. We're going to just be on the dollar and on the crypto, and they'll be able to impact the U.S. dollar, the Federal Reserve note, as through the use of the cryptos. This is why, well, I won't go into any of the personalities and any of that, but nonetheless, you will see that there are trends emerging in this year that will validate what I'm telling you now. And so I'm not worried about the apparent crash in the crypto prices. It means nothing to me because the cryptos are being valued against the central bank issued fiat dollar, and it is deflating. So if there are vast quantities of dollars taken away from the system, and then inherently that means that we're deflating the number of dollars relative to the number of cryptos, and thus the flow rate. Now we also have other things, right? We've got this pending SpaceX IPO and all of that. There's a certain amount of people that are cashing out of cryptos now in order to be able to buy in on that and all this kind of thing. So there are all these other subcurrents that are going on that are affecting the macro level of the economics. But at the macro level, at the meta-macro level, we're dealing with a deflationary spiral and the government and the fiduciary authorities attempting to get us out of it. This is one of the reasons that we're at war with Iran. We have to get rid of some of these bad actors within the fiduciary authorities, and they use Iran as a very powerful tool, so we need to take that tool away from them in order to get back at them and kick them in the ass and get them to out of the business of controlling and destroying the future of humanity by controlling and destroying fiat currencies at their whim. So we're separating ourselves from this ancient system of these controllers, and we're doing it at a fundamental policy and strategic technology way. So I'm quite happy. I'm an optimist, right? I'm very much an optimist about the future of humanity. And to some extent, I'm very optimistic about the chaos and the horror and the problems we're going to go through these next 2 years, because we'll come through them. And it's going to be a very good learning experience for us, however much pain we have to absorb in order to take those lessons. So I'm not offering any advice on how to position yourself throughout this. I'm just saying that it is a natural pre-designed from back in. So the first time I ever came across any hint in any computer discussions or anywhere of cryptocurrency had nothing to do with cryptocurrency. It had to do with the idea of how to safeguard digital information. And it was within a security forum, a dial-up BBS in the 1980s, among which there were many government guys. There was also people from the Federal Reserve and all these kind of guys, because they were interested in this. And all of that discussion resolved down from 87 or 88 into like the mid 90s, and it came down to, actually it was 92, that the first solution was proposed, but it was called the solution to the double spend problem. And that was the core of all cryptocurrencies, is the ability to restrict the possibility to double spend a currency that is essentially just a number. And so anybody could have that number and they could go spend it, right? But you needed to restrict it to the actual ownership chain and the custodian of it. And that's why you're not, by the way, an owner of a cryptocurrency insofar as the government is concerned. You're a custodian of it because you cannot physically take possession of it. Even if you have that number, you can't use it absent the wallet and the system itself. So you'll never be able to be an owner of a cryptocurrency in the eyes of the law. You're always going to be a custodian of digital information. In any event, okay, at some point they're going to actually monetize the custodian relationship, but that's probably 10 or 15 years out. But in my way of thinking, that we're going to use, the government, the powers that be, will use this vehicle that they've got right in front of them. And in fact, I think I'm seeing them make moves to that effect now. And they will use that as the method of driving inflation back into the system, and thus liquidity back into the system, thus demand, thus growth, business activity, et cetera, et cetera. And that I'm thinking that there will be a big push for this 2026 and 2027 with real impacts showing up for lots of people being able to breathe a sigh of relief a little bit and see their lives picking up by the end of 2027. And that a lot of people will indeed have to suffer a great deal as we go through in rest of 2026 and 2027, just by the very nature of the powers that be having to fuck with something as fundamental as the relationship of currencies. Now, as a small aside, no, I don't think this is going to impact the nominal price of gold or silver. As they put inflation into the cryptocurrencies, they are to some extent, they are abandoning gold and silver as the government, I mean, and fiduciary responsibilities, as any form of a sound money. So we won't go back to circulating gold and silver as currency. We will always have that ability because they need to maintain that. So governments will always want to maintain the idea of a 1 ounce of gold being worth some amount of money and being able to exchange for public and private debt. They need that. But we're not going to go back to that system. In fact, we're not even going to have a system anymore where nation states move gold and silver back and forth to each other in order to settle currency drawdowns from the outside world in the trade. We won't even be doing that. In my opinion, as my data had shown since like 2003 when it was discussed as the new money, in my opinion, Bitcoin will be used in international settlements between countries, and it'll be rising to that nominal value to meet those demands within the currency world, the debt-based currency world of fiat. And so as we need to settle bigger and bigger debts, there will always be an inflationary pressure put on Bitcoin and thus all the other cryptos as these are used in this manner. So it provides the vehicle for government to have continuous inflation without a direct impact on the cost of goods and services if they use Bitcoin as the back end, or cryptos as the back end servicing for currency valuation balancing globally relative to what's going on economically, politically, and so on. So in that sense, I'm very optimistic, right? They've got their solution. They'll engineer it. They're not that stupid. They're just slow. Well, they are stupid, but they're slow. It'll take them a while to get it together. And then we'll all be working on you'll still have dollars. You'll still have Federal Reserve notes, although I do know that there is hints within the data and within their activities even today that we're going to be getting a U.S. Treasury issued internal circulation dollar. So that's my thinking, is that they'll restrict it to use only in the United States. So you could buy a Treasury issued dollar in Europe, but you couldn't spend it there. No one would accept it because the United States government wouldn't accept it coming back from a foreign place. This way, they'll be able to control the liquidity, the circulation, all aspects of it, and it'll kick the Federal Reserve note down to virtually nothing, which means, by extension, that anything valued in Federal Reserve notes will go through the roof as this activity occurs. Basically, all of it. So I expect at the end of 2027, we'll have very much higher cryptocurrency prices. We'll have very much higher gold and silver prices. We may have a whole lot more increase in prices for, eggs, milk, cheese, all of this kind of stuff, ordinary staples in Federal Reserve notes. I'm certain that will be the case as soon as the Treasury starts issuing dollars. That's going to be somewhat of a separating schism in our financial system because they need to shift some level of value over into what they will think of as a one tier up currency, first tier currency based on sound money, because they'll back that dollar by gold, silver, oil in Alaska, whatever the fuck, something. And maybe even back it partially by the holdings of the government in cryptocurrencies. And over time, their activities will tend to concentrate all the Bitcoin in the hands of the big players. And they'll need that in order to do these cross-border settlements. So the system itself will be able to continue on functioning effectively and providing what we have now and growing everything as what we have now. So in this sense, I'm not a prepper. I don't expect the system to come unglued. I expect bits and pieces of it to break and be replaced, not even patched over, but just replaced with new stuff, right? That works better because we have these new vehicles now, we have these new opportunities now that have never existed in the past. So we will rhyme, right? We'll echo the past, but we're not going to repeat it. Many people, for instance, may not even really notice in their own lives and stuff, the impact of the deflation until it's well underway. And then they'll sort of say, oh, I guess we are in a depression, that sort of thing. But they'll just be plugging along. They'll be on the more virtuous side of things as the powers that be replace all of the underlying technology and boost us up into sci-fi world in its form of interpersonal exchange in the form of all of these different kinds of currencies. So in sci-fi world, you'll be able to trade gold, silver, coins, monetized custodial relationship with cryptos, and all different kinds of activity with different levels of impact on your life. And so we'll get into a multipolar world, but it's not really discussing multiple, political areas. More, it's discussing multiple currencies that everybody will be able to use for their, and it really does free us, right? In terms of you'll have many choices that you don't now. It'll make things a little bit more confusing for a while, but you'll get the hang of it really quick. It's like going on a cruise and going to a bunch of different countries and collecting all of their different currencies. You don't do that so much anymore, but you used to be able to do that where you'd cruise 8 countries in a river trip in Europe, and you'd end up with 8 different currencies just at every stop doing all these activities. Anyway, so that's basically this little discussion on deflation. The point being to bring out, calm everybody down, and also say that, yeah, we are having deflation. Yeah, we are in a depression, but it's not going to be like the Great Depression. Maybe they'll call it the Greater Depression or something, but it's going to be different because we have all of these differences in our social order now. And we're just simply echoing the deflationary trends that caused the previous Great Depression, the crash in the 50s, the crash in the 60s, the separation of the gold to the currency in the 70s, etc. We're just still on that same train. It also has a tendency to produce and be involved with the wars. But once we get out of this, once we get in through this period here, we'll have destroyed the triumvirate, the 3 city-states, City of London, Vatican, and Washington, D.C., as separate entities with their money laundering and all of that, and things will be very much boosted up for a considerable period of time. So like I say, I'm quite optimistic. Anyway, that's it. I got to get on my list and get my stuff done. Again, not financial advice on how to do things, but I'm not particularly worried about the state of affairs at the moment. I've been expecting the deflationary trend, and we're here now.